Welcome to Litpoetry, the podcast where we go on a journey of discovery, reading, analyzing, and discussing great poetry from around the world. Poetry is worth it because the reading and writing of poetry is a revolutionary act that has the potential to transform both the reader and our world.
Welcome to the Lit Poetry Podcast Season 1. My name is James Laidler, Australian poet, writer and your host. In today's episode, we'll be cutting off branches and uncovering the roots of the past with the poem Family Tree by Australian poet Michelle Seminara. This poem comes from her soon-to-be-released collection of poems entitled Suburban Fantasy, published by the University of Western Australia Press. This book is going to be launched in June this year. Michelle has kindly agreed to join us here on the Lit Poetry Podcast to discuss both her new collection and the poem of hers that we'll be featuring in today's episode. So welcome, Michelle, to the program. It's an absolute pleasure to have you as our very first guest on the Lit Poetry Podcast.
Hi, James. Thank you so much. I'm completely honoured, especially to be your first guest.
Oh, that's no problem at all. So, Michelle, maybe we can start just a little bit because our audience may not be very familiar with your work. Can you tell us a bit about yourself as a poet and, maybe some of your inspirations or even how you came to love poetry as your life developed and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm quite surprised to be a poet. I've always loved reading and read poetry from a very young age, but I never thought I would find myself writing it. I just didn't think I would be any good, basically. And I think it wasn't until I turned about 40, I suddenly developed this love for poetry. And I think it may have been because our family was going through some quite, difficult, challenging times. And I had 3 quite young children. I didn't have much time on my hands, but I really needed to express myself and get some stuff out. And I think that's where poetry really comes to its comes before. It deals with the very deep things in life. And also being a mum at that time with quite young kids, I literally did not have my hands free to sit and write, but I wanted to write. So I found that poetry was a great medium because I was able to write in my head while my hands are full of babies and washing and so on, and then write it down later. So it was a little bit of necessity, emotional and physical.
So would it be right to say that it gave you some sort of sense of sanity? Is there a connection between that reality that you've lived and your love of poetry and the evolution of this particular work?
Yeah, I think there is. I think, I'm a big fan of, it's a bit cliche, but I don't care. I'm a big fan of more confessional poets like Sexton and Plath. I love Larkin, Elizabeth Bishop and so on. I love gutsy female poetry that really speaks about the truth of, of life as a woman, as a mother and so forth. So, yeah, I think there is definitely a correlation, and Suburban Fantasy is a book, it's more of a David Lynch than a Betty Crocker sort of thing. It's it's the underbelly, the dark side of what goes on behind all those closed doors. And just people's sense that as they do get older, and I think 40 is always a big one for people in their life. You get to a certain point and you sort of spend the first half of your life aspiring to or trying to build something up in terms of family or career or whatever your aspirations are. And then the reality of what you have is often very different from the dream that you're sold. So, the book explores that quite a lot.
Yeah, and I imagine, coming into, turning 40, that there's a lot of fertile ground that you can draw from, a lot of experiences of life that flow into your work as well. Did you say, is that, and you talk about the exploration of sort of dark material. So can you tell us a little bit about how Suburban Fantasy actually, to what extent does it actually map your life, or is it, are you reflecting on things outside your life as well, or what sort of mixture of material is it?
I think it's probably 50-50. It's definitely the inspiration and the sort of emotional spark comes from all personal experiences, but from there the book definitely launches off to talk about, just the social issues, for example, function and dysfunction within families, mental health, and just the position of, women within society and so forth. So, there's definitely not all navel-gazing, I hope.
No, that's certainly the way I find your poetry. So, I've been reading your upcoming work, and I found it it's kind of reminiscent of Plath to me, that it does have this real personal bent to it that actually makes it very, very strong and poignant. But it also, I think it's talking about something far more universal. So I think it's sort of the sort of poetry that you can really relate to, that also has an edge of social critique about it.
Thank you, Yeah, I definitely hope it's universal. I think sometimes when you write, the more particular and personal you get, the more universal something can become, because if you're being sort of quite brutally honest, then at the heart of it, we all go through certain just human experiences, and I think people can relate. And I quite I'm more of a better out than in poet, I suppose, so I quite like to be brave and to say the things that aren't necessarily easy to say or to hear, and I think that helps other people read them and know they're not alone.
Well, I wonder if that's part of the purpose of poetry, that to write the words that people are often feeling but can't express, and to probably help people not feel alone in that reality as well, a sense of solidarity. It's a very important medium, I think. The work.
I do believe that. Yeah.
Yeah, so what really interests me about the work is it's sectioned off. There's 4 sections of the collection, and I'll just tell the audience a little bit about it. So, first section is called Blood Nature. The second section is Suburban Fantasy. The third section is Second Coming. I'm not sure if that's a reference to a particular poem. Could be. We'll find that out soon. And the final one is Incarnation, I believe. Or Incarnate?
Incarnate,
yeah. So could you give us a little bit of background about what you're thinking behind these sections and what they perhaps represent, or what sort of journey you're taking the reader on with them?
Sure. Well, I suppose, generally when you're putting together a poetry manuscript, it's always a little bit of magic, and we're hoping things will coalesce, because, usually most poets are writing individual poems or suites of poems, and there's going to be themes that emerge, but to get that to, come into something that, as you say, I think a poetry manuscript, when you're sequencing it, has to become more than the sum of its parts. It does have to take the reader on a journey. So as I was putting all the poems together, there are many poems that I think in themselves are quite reasonable poems that could have been in the collection, but out they had to go because they didn't fit in thematically. And so as I sort of shuffled the papers around on the floor, as you do, a theme started to emerge, and those 4 sections seemed to make a kind of thematic sense to me. So I think Blood Nature is poems written, several years ago now, but more when I was in really the thick of a whole lot of, really full-on emotional stuff. And I think those poems really reflect that. And then sort of moving on from that, coming on to Suburban Fantasy once again, taking that but looking out more universally at the experiences of other people in their domestic situations, and particularly women and mothers as well, as a big theme there. And in Second Coming, I think there's a piece that is, or a wisdom that is starting to emerge. It's looking back over experiences rather than being in the very thick of them, and finding teachings and learnings and reflecting upon them, and coming to a sort of peace with those situations. And in Incarnate, even zooming further back, I suppose, and just thinking about the human condition in general, and impermanence and death and so on.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, no, that really connects with me, what you're saying there. Interestingly, the poem we're going to listen to today, which is a video now on YouTube on the Litpoetry site for Family Tree. So that's the name of the poem, Family Tree. It actually comes from the first section of the collection called Blood Nature, which you just mentioned is you reflecting on the past and your emotional experience and that sort of thing. Would that be true to say over this poem?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this one was written several years ago, and at a time when things seemed a little bit dire. So it does reflect that in its imagery and subject matter. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's have a listen to the poem, and then we'll maybe try to unpack it.
Great.
Family Tree by Michelle Seminara. They cut the limbs off first, of that tree, which is me, the one which blares the blaring yellow X on its chest. The arborist's eye could see it had been wounded long ago. Then disease entered the hole at its heart. Then necrosis, gliding through the vessels in a cool gray onslaught, weakening the branches we once festooned for Christmas and Halloween. Nobody noticed for a long time, especially I didn't notice. Not until the last leaves slipped to the pavement did I look up. They amputate the limbs to make it easier to fell. I know that feeling. Now all through the house, the stench of diesel and that terrible, enraged squealing.
Great. So, yeah, that's the poem. So just a little bit of background about Family Tree. So Michelle and I started talking to each other online. We've both got different projects we've been working on. One of mine is actually taking poems and trying to create video poems. What are the themes and the ideas? What was it behind Michelle's thinking when she created this very evocative poem? So over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, and thank you so much for making it into a video. It was so beautiful to see. It's such a privilege to have somebody take something that's created and reinterpret it in a different artistic format. I think that what you're doing with the video poetry on Litpoetry is very exciting, and I'm so happy to have been a little part of that. And I absolutely love the video. I hope people go and have a little look at it and your other videos, because I think you're doing some beautiful work, and I find it very exciting that there's more of this happening in Australian poetry, that the words aren't just staying on the page, they're being reinterpreted in like a visual and audio medium. With Family Tree, as I said, written quite a few years ago, and one of the I think that in this poem there's quite a lot of violent imagery in a way.
There is.
And one of the things I loved about your interpretation of it in the poetry video was the fact that it was very calm, the juxtaposition of the very calm narration and the music. And then there's imagery of, tree lopping happening. And so there's that juxtaposition of that sort of violence or the amputation of the tree limbs, and it's very calm background, and I like that, because I think it actually makes it all the more sinister, to be honest.
Well, I think that's true, and I think when you think about family, and I mean, this is a universal thing, that every family has levels of dysfunction. They come in different forms, of course, but so often, it's very much often behind closed doors. It's like people put a spin on family, and there's a veneer that people see, which I think the poem kind of connects with this kind of sort of quite tranquil music. And yet under the surface, there's this much more sinister work of sort of pulling down this tree, and, the idea of disease certainly comes into the poem, and that sort of thing. So I suppose from my perspective, I'm really interested, because it's clearly some sort of extended metaphor that you're playing with here with the tree. So, and you don't have to go there if you don't want to, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about a little bit about what's the background with what's going on in this poem.
Well, a lot of it is, some aspects of it are quite autobiographical. So it actually was a tree outside our house, a very lovely tree. And it did get that big yellow X in it, when they've decided, someone in council has decided that it's, it's not safe. It was, hanging over a footpath and had the X in it, the big yellow spray paint. So, we could tell it was going to come down. And it was a tree. I'm a bit of a hippie, bit of a tree hugger. It was a tree I was quite fond of. And also it just kind of, I don't know, for me it just became to symbolise, because of the timing of this tree coming down, a lot of things that were happening within my family structure at the time. So things where that you were cobbling things together, everyone trying their best to get on, hope things would be okay. And at a time when the wheels just fell off, and it just was very clear that it was no longer, okay. And so I actually felt a real sort of simpatico with this tree. It felt like one by one my limbs were being, not myself just as an individual, but my family. And I suppose as a mother you have that sense of being very much responsible for, and of course as a father as well, responsible for your family, your children and so forth, and trying very hard to keep it all healthy, and having to come to a point where you realise that's not necessarily within your control, and you kind of do need to let some things go, let some limbs drop off, or the whole thing comes down and you rebuild. So the downing of this tree physically, outside our house happened to coincide with that sort of metaphorical or emotional, action. And so you're right, it just became an extended metaphor. I really felt like that poor old tree.
And you mentioned the tree also and how it played a role in Christmas and Halloween celebrations, and I assume, so that was literally something that happened, that you would light it up with them.
Yeah. When my kids were smaller, it was lovely. We'd put all the Christmas lights out there. Halloween, we were one of those houses that would, like Halloween, my favourite holiday, I think. So, put all the stuff. And so it was just something that we had to let go, and it was symbolic of letting go of lots of, I suppose, dreams and aspirations, perhaps, for your family or your relationships or the dynamics, things that you had hoped would be ideal, and that you, as you mature and as everybody, everybody's own different personalities and issues, families are such complicated structures, to just realise that that ideal was a sense in a fantasy, and you're left with something much more complex.
And I find the line that nobody noticed for a long time, especially I didn't notice, quite very powerful. And I assume here that, could you say it's partly autobiographical, but you're also there's something else. It's a deeper commentary. I imagine that again is probably perhaps universal. Can you tell me about that sort of sentiment you were trying to get to there?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think with that, it's once again that idea of, we tend to keep ourselves busy, and especially when you have young children in a family, you just keep going. You just keep doing what you can do, and when things are diseased, in a sense, symbolically, when there's issues you're not dealing with, they are eroding from the inside, but up to a certain point, you can look away and pretend these things aren't happening. And I think that everyone can relate to that in different aspects of their lives. So, I think that's what those lines are referring to. And I think probably, in a sense, as the mother of my family on a more individual level, I was probably the last one to notice, well, probably the first and the last, or the first to notice, but the last to accept, because it's difficult to accept more complex realities. Yeah,
that's right. And I think probably everyone's familiar too with family problems in households and stuff where there are, in some ways there's an inability to actually acknowledge some problems because it goes against the narrative. And those breakthrough moments where things do get actually seen for what they are, sometimes kind of never really appear in for some families. Maybe it's too painful, but when they do come, they can be extremely traumatic.
Yeah, and it's very much a sense of, rather than trying to fix what's there, sometimes you have to let things fall.
Yes.
You know, you have to cut them down or cut certain things off, and then you have to rebuild again. So,
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's that moment where you sort of realize that as much as you've tried to make things okay, it's just not within your power. And it's a very human moment. It's not necessarily to do with families or parenthood, but just it happens in many aspects of our lives where we try to control things to make them okay, and at a certain point we realize it's not in our power. And what do you do then? You have to accept that. You're very humbled, and you really need to the help of others to help rebuild yourself and rebuild your life. So I think that's one of the strengths of poetry. It allows you to sort of encode that emotion, you know, within the words and transport into the reader's heart, you know, so it has like a little explosion inside them, and they actually experience that with you. And especially if they've had, you know, similar experiences, as you say, they are universal. That's where poetry's, I think, real strength lies, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
In dealing with that deep, dark stuff. And that's for myself. That's whenever I read poetry, that's what I'm looking for. You know, that's just me. But I think many people turn to something like poetry in a similar way they turn to, say, a spiritual or religious practice.
Yeah.
They're looking for meaning. They're looking for some wisdom or some way to get through a dark moment or to understand things in a different manner.
And I think they're trying to also dig down to the truth of things, you know, what's under all the subterfuge and all that sort of stuff. I know it's quite interesting with poetry, like, so I teach poetry as well, and just recently I was teaching the Windhover by Jared Manley Hopkins, which is a poem of joy, really. There's this guy watching a falcon in the sky, and the words themselves dance on the page like the falcon does. It's an amazing poem. It's full of joy. And the kids that I was teaching were really struggling to understand why this poem was really important and why it was so rare. And eventually a student understood and was able to name that it's a poem about joy. So, and that's very different from pleasure. And it was a fantastic conversation where we were talking about how our world runs on pleasure. We're all seeking pleasure. But in some ways, pleasure is like a mutated form of what the best stuff is. And the best stuff is actually joy. And joy is something that is outside yourself. It's beyond yourself. It's not about pulling into yourself. It's about moving into something bigger than you. It's like celebration. And, you know, the smiles on their faces when they left that class, I remember, because I think it was just the thought that they don't think about enough, you know, and we don't think about it enough. So I think you're right there that whether it's dark or whether it's light, poetry allows us to explore emotions that we neglect and that we need to, you know, draw out into the light in some way. So,
that's so beautiful. That's a gorgeous example.
Yeah, it was a very, very good class, actually. So I think this is a fantastic poem. The other thing that sort of I think warrants attention, I was really curious about. So early on in the poem, it talks about the blaring yellow X on the chest of the tree and the arborist's eye. So it seems to me the start of the poem, there is this sort of sense that there is an outside world that's in judgment looking in. And I suppose I have questions. So it's about a family tree, it's about you, but there's also this perception of something from the outside as well. Like, do you have any thoughts about that? Because that really sort of pricked my curiosity.
Oh, that's really interesting. I actually hadn't thought about that in relation to this poem. I love it when people bring up things in your own poetry like that. It's really interesting. Yeah, I think, you know, one of a lot of the poems, especially in this first section of Suburban Fantasy, you know, as I said, they do come from quite personal experience, and they were, you know, difficult times and written in the midst of those difficult time. So yeah, a lot of the themes are similar in this poem and those other poems in that section. Do explore the idea of what happens when the wheels do come off, and when everyone just has to sit and starkly look at the truth, and when you can no longer present the pretty picture to the world, you know. So I had another poem, I think it was from my first collection called Engraft, and it was called That House. And it was basically about becoming that house in the street, you know, the one where there's a police car pull up or an ambulance pull up, or people are looking, craning their heads because the screaming's coming from out of there. And it's like that sort of thing when you can no longer put up that facade, and it really cracks you open in a way. Which is very humbling, sometimes even humiliating, you know, but you've got to, it's at a point where you can no longer paper over things. And so, you know, perhaps the arborist I refers to that sort of outside gaze, and also to the gaze of, you know, the mental health system, psychologists, psychiatrists and so on, because there's a lot of, when you're having those, you know, sort of issues, obviously you're seeking help in different ways, for yourself, your family members and family generally, and you get a variety of specialists, you know, giving you advice, some of which is very helpful and some of which is quite harmful often. So it's interesting.
It is, and maybe you could even make an argument. But it's very interesting when you do poetry, and I love talking about this with students as well, how really, you know, meaning is not fixed in a poem, that you certainly had intent in creating your poem, but really, you know, the reader reads completely other meanings into it, and they're all legitimate interpretations in some way. So like we create meaning when we read, which is a very fascinating idea, which goes against, you know, traditional models of education, which still people haven't sort of come to grips with, that this is the reality. It's not like an author has these pearls of wisdom and then they sort of pour it all into the text and that is the fixed meaning. And well, it doesn't work that way. And I suppose with the arborist, I suppose just off the top of my head, as my own reading, I could say, well, in some ways your present self, or the self you were when you wrote this poem, you are the arborist. So you're the arborist looking back and assessing and looking at the wounded past and all that sort of stuff. So that's probably another interpretation you could look.
I love that. Yeah, it's the best, isn't it? It's the best thing about poetry, and I can see why for students it could be like challenging at first to be encouraged to relate to a text in that way, because it's much easier to just be told, well, here's what it means. And, you know, you regurgitate that, but that can't be done with poetry, and that's, you know, that's one of its greatest beauties.
No, and a poem is something that you should be able to come back to and find new meaning, and it might change with, you know, where your life is at. Best poems do that, I think. They just constantly give to you at different points in your life.
Absolutely,
wisdom.
Yeah, they kind of sit in your heart. You carry them around, and then it's time they ripen, you know, at different times and in different ways.
And where it's very different from fiction. Like I think, you know, again, we live in a world of, you know, polarized thinking, where people want to know the value of something. They want to know what's the right way to act, what's the not right way, and people feel very uncomfortable sort of existing in that grey area in between. I think poetry presents you with that grey area. It doesn't give definitive, you know, this way or not that way. Like, it has value systems embedded in it, but it's a wrestle. You know, the poetry is essentially encourages you to go into a wrestle, and that's not a comfortable state. And so I think when that's a good thing to talk about with people, and why you should read poetry, but you need to come with it with the state of mind that I'm up for the wrestle. I'm up for the exploration, and I might be in my, you know, in that sort of a discomfort zone, but that's the fertile ground where things actually grow. So.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And often, like, you know, was it T.S. Eliot? I think he said, you know, paraphrasing something about, you know, a poem. You can know a poem before you understand a poem. You know, it's not an intellectual. We really you know, focus on intellectual understanding of text, and poetry subverts that. It's so slippery little sucker. It will not be pinned down, and it doesn't just work on one level. That's its beauty. So There are many poems which I just love. They mean so much to me. But,
Yes.
for example, if I had to analyse them, I'd be very hard-pressed to write a few coherent sentences about them. But it doesn't matter because they mean something and they reverberate through your mind and your spirit in a different way than a strictly sort of intellectual understanding can.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. So look, we just might have a quick break and we'll come back and we'll talk about a few other things. Okay, welcome back. You're listening to the Litpoetry podcast, and we have Michelle Seminara here discussing her poetry and Family Tree, one of her poems in particular. And I suppose we've got to that point in the discussion where I'd just like to sort of go a little bit sideways and just talk about poetry in general. Now, Michelle's deeply involved with a website platform called Laidler, and I think it would be great for her to actually advertise that here and tell us a little bit about her work with that website and what they're doing with it. Yeah, so over to you, Michelle.
Oh, thanks, James. Suburban. I've been managing editor there for about 5 years now. It's kind of crept up on me, and I started just as a poetry reader on the journal. Also, Nigel Featherstone was the managing editor for about 5 years before that. So I didn't have any aspirations to sort of run a literary journal, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. But he, to focus more on his own writing, he needed to step back from that, and no one else put their hand up. And I loved the journal and didn't want to see it go under, so I decided to, quite bravely or naively or both, step up and try and figure out how to run it. And it's year by year been progressing and growing from there. But for me, we publish all sorts on Laidler, so we're poetry, fiction, non-fiction, reviews and interviews. But for me, I must admit, we do publish probably more poetry than anything because I am a bit biased.
Yeah, well, I think there's some spectacular poetry there, and I think what you do really well too is that you've given a platform for some marginal voices to sort of get their chance to be heard as well. There's a real host of voices, and I've read through some of the poetry there, and it's beautifully presented. There's this really nice sort of motif of black and white imagery that runs through the whole thing, which is gorgeous. When you see it, it's quite stunning.
Thank you. Yeah, we're very lucky to have Karen use our website designer. She jumped in and she's gorgeous. She's a writer herself, and this is her little side gig doing. She's a great children's author, but she was lovely, and she said, "Oh, would you like some help? Your website's looking a little bit old." And I said, "Okay." So when she looked behind the scenes, she was like, "Oh my gosh, how is this website even still standing? Do you ever update anything?" Because technically, I'm not the most, I know how to press the buttons and make the posts appear and make it look nice, but I certainly don't really. I'm no great tech guru. So she stepped in, and I think she's created the most beautiful site. I love it. Yeah,
well, I think on the literary scene, I think Laidler is really. It's performing a great task for Australia, actually, and the world for that matter. And I really want to encourage people to check it out. So the website there, I assume it's just www.verityla, so VERITYLA.com. So definitely check that out. So a couple of more things about maybe the website or poetry in general. So what sort of state do you think Australian poetry is in? You're probably got your finger on the pulse a little bit, and poets, and you've been publishing poetry. And what's the future look like for Australian poetry in general?
I think that generally there's a lot of really exciting voices and exciting things happening. Unfortunately, in terms of where you can get published and your chances of getting a book published and so on, those opportunities are drying up at quite an alarming rate. As arts funding has been diminishing, literature generally, doesn't get much of a share of art funding to start with, and poetry is sort of the very poor end of literature, there's a lot of really talented people doing really exciting stuff. Unfortunately, in Australian culture, there's not a huge appreciation of poetry generally, and certainly not a lot of resources. So, many of the poetry publishers, in terms of, being able to get a book published, they only take a handful of books every year, or they've closed down completely. So at the moment, I think it's quite a difficult time for poets to get their work out there, and certainly there's a big push, to pay poets, to pay writers, to pay editors, and that's something we've always endeavoured to do on Verity La, and we've managed to some extent. But if the money isn't there, you can't sort of magically make it appear either. So, it's a bit of a catch-22, that one.
It is, and I think it's the great dilemma for Australia, because we have such a small population that it really makes it very hard for writers in Australia to make a living. I think most writers and poets in Australia have to hold down other jobs. Writing is really just something they do on the side.
Yeah.
But I think also...
And I think that's one thing... Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that... And so with Verity La, which you do take submissions, I know you're not taking submissions at the moment, but for people to have access to a website like that where they can potentially get their work published, because, part of the goal of, if you want to get poetry published and collections, that you need to actually be getting your work regularly published in journals.
Yeah, you need to get a little bit of
you need to get noticed.
A few runs on the...
You do. And again,
exactly.
I think, but I think that's fantastic, and what a great role that you're providing.
Thank you. Yeah.
But sorry, I cut you off there.
We've been very lucky. No, that's okay. Just going to say, we've been so lucky. We've got some, fabulous editors on the journal. As you said, we have different streams of publishing for, different types of voices, and some really experienced editors working in terms of, we've got Clozapine Clinic, which is one of my favourite publishing streams on the journal, headed up by Tim Heffern and Annalise Blaney. So, they're peer support workers working in the mental health system. Tim's the Deputy Mental Health Commissioner for New South Wales, and a fabulous poet. And so, that stream of publishing, for example, takes submissions from people identifying as having mental health issues, and so you get mentorship, and it's just fabulous. I think some of my favourite works on the journal have come through those specialised streams of publishing, because I think that when people are living sometimes through more extreme situations, so for example, if they are struggling with their mental health or whatever it is, or more living on the margins of society for whatever reasons, then this is when poetry it's not just an intellectual exercise, it's a part of survival, it's a passion.
Yes.
People really write from the depths of themselves, and it leads to really interesting, not just changes in subject matter and intensity of the work, but also the form of the work. I know in Clozapine Clinic, as people are looking for an objective correlative in the form of the poem, or the prose piece, that correlates with their internal sense of time and reality and what's happening. They break and fracture and change form in a really interesting way. So some of my favourite works come through those
and it's great,
specialised publishing streams.
Yeah, and you're giving voice to those on the margins. And I think the politics of inclusion that's at the heart of what you're doing is very, very, very important in a society like ours, because those voices from the margin have the potential to actually change the dominant culture, and if they're not heard, change won't happen. So more reason to read the poetry that's available on Verity La. It's very, very important.
Thank you. It's lovely to bring people just on centre stage as well. That's a platform that you can offer to people, and that's one of the things I like about the journal, is that we publish one individual piece when we're not publishing it, when we do twice a week, and so therefore everyone gets to be star of the week. Your piece isn't buried amongst 50 other pieces as it would be if a big issue of work was being published. So it really does platform people's voices. But another thing I'd like to do more on with the journal is to be more outward looking, to look more internationally. We're getting a lot of international submissions at the moment, and there's some, interesting things happening in countries all around the world, and especially, as I'm more clued in with poetry. And I think one of the downsides of Australian poetry is because we can get a bit insular. Most journals publish, particularly, mainly Australian work, and everyone's kind of looking inwards at each other. And there's a big wide world out there, and I think we would benefit from looking outwards, especially now it's so easy to do so. And for Verity La being a solely digital platform, it's a no-brainer. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, we'll just take a quick break, and I'll come back with a final question for you. Okay, Michelle?
Great.
Okay, so this is the first interview that we've actually done on Lit Poetry, and I figured I actually wanted to finish by something maybe I'll do with all the guests that we have on. And I just want you to take a moment, and Michelle, can you tell us, if I was to ask you why poetry, what would you want to say to our audience?
Well, I think we've touched upon it throughout our chat. For me, why poetry is because when there are those intense emotions or experiences, in your life or the lives of others, it seems like poetry is, to me, one of the only forms that is able to express and channel that sort of energy, whether that be a joy or a deep sorrow. And I think this is one of the reasons why, people who maybe never read or poetry at funerals and at, weddings, it's trundled out. The big moments, poetry is there, and that's I think one of its functions. It's you don't have to worry about plot or narrative or other sort of devices. It's uniquely placed to be able to speak to what is deepest, I think, in the human condition and heart and soul.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful answer, and a great way to start our interviews here on Lit Poetry. So I want to thank you, Michelle, for talking to us today and sharing your wonderful poem, Family Tree. And I'll encourage people in June. It is June when the Suburban Fantasy comes out. Is that correct?
Yes, it's coming out in June. I'll get a launch. I've started thinking I have to figure out launches and readings and things, which I'm, a bit shy, but it's part of the job. So, June.
Yeah. So it's been wonderful having you. Now, before I leave, I just want to remind all our listeners that if you're after more poetry resources, feel free to visit our website at litpoetry.com. A fantastic video of this poem, Family Tree, is also available on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to support our work, we'd really appreciate if you'd subscribe to our podcast or our Lit Poetry YouTube channel. We'll finish with one last hearing of the poem. And again, thanks to you, Michelle. And we'll speak again in the future, no doubt.
Thank you so much, Jane.
Okay, see you later.
Family Tree by Michelle Seminara. They cut the limbs off first, of that tree, which is me, the one which blares the blaring yellow X on its chest. The arborist's eye could see it had been wounded long ago. Then disease entered the hole at its heart, then necrosis, gliding through the vessels in a cool gray onslaught, weakening the branches we once festooned for Christmas and Halloween. Nobody noticed for a long time, especially I didn't notice. Not until the last leaves slipped to the pavement did I look up. They amputate the limbs to make it easier to fell. I know that feeling. Now all through the house, the stench of diesel and that terrible, enraged squealing. You've been listening to the Lit Poetry Podcast, presented by James Laidler. For more podcasts, poetry videos, and other useful resources, visit our website at www.litpoetry.com. Thanks for listening.